In the 1968 Sergio Leone western Once Upon a Time in the West, the mysterious gunfighter Harmonica, named for the musical instruments worn around his neck, arrives in the frontier town of Flagstone on a quest for vengeance. The object of his unexplained vendetta is the aging outlaw Frank, a ruthless hired gun now working as an enforcer for the wealthy railroad tycoon Mr. Morton, who, crippled by spinal tuberculosis, dreams of extending his railroad to the Pacific Ocean before he dies. In order to realize this vision, however, Morton must acquire the nearby Sweetwater Ranch, which is in the possession of the McBains, a family of immigrant homesteaders. Instructed by Morton to scare the family into selling the property, Frank instead murders them, leaving behind planted evidence to implicate another outlaw, Cheyenne, in the crime. But unbeknownst to both Frank and Morton, the patriarch of the McBain family had married 1 month earlier to a New Orleans prostitute, Jill, leaving her as Sweetwater's sole heir. Arriving to the funeral of her would-be family, Jill resolves to fight for Sweetwater and forms an unlikely alliance with Cheyenne, who, eager to clear his name, takes her side in the struggle for the ranch. Morton wants to make Jill a deal, but Frank has plans of his own, and intends to win Sweetwater for himself by any means necessary. However, after Frank coerces Jill into auctioning the property, Harmonica unexpectedly places the winning bid, working with Cheyenne to use the money from his bounty as part of an elaborate scheme to win the land. Now at odds with Frank over the future of Sweetwater, Morton bribes Frank's own men into killing him, only to be thwarted by Harmonica, who is determined to protect his enemy, keeping him alive only for his own vengeance. When Frank returns to Morton's train car to confront him, he finds him dying from a gunshot wound sustained during a fight with Cheyenne, who has now escaped from custody. Morton dies with the sound of the Pacific Ocean echoing through his mind. With nothing left to lose, Frank seeks out Harmonica in Sweetwater, where Harmonica tells him that they are both members of an ancient race, soon to be killed off by the modern world. Frank confesses that he cares for nothing now, only his contest with this mysterious stranger, and the truth behind his quest for vengeance. As they square off for the final showdown, a flashback reveals that Frank murdered Harmonica's brother when he was a boy, stifling his cries with the harmonica which he still carries. Outmatched, Frank is defeated, and as he dies, Harmonica finally reveals his true identity, reminding Frank of his crime in his final moments. Harmonica and Cheyenne leave Sweetwater, but as they depart, Cheyenne dies after revealing that he sustained a fatal wound during his gunfight with Morton and his men. As the new town is built around them, Harmonica rides into the desert with Cheyenne's body, and Jill brings water to the railroad workers. In an interview found in the 1986 book Conversations avec Sergio Leone, Leone confirmed that which was already implicit in the film. The hero Harmonica, though played by a white actor, is a Native American who, quote, hates white men. Equipped with this understanding, the true symbolic subtext of the narrative can be quickly apprehended. The story's antagonists, Frank and Morton, represent, respectively, the dual forces of white violence and capital that built the Western world. This is first indicated when, in the character's establishing shots, Morton is seen clutching a tin conquistador juxtaposed against a model of one of his trains, establishing a thematic link to Western colonialism. This is reflected in his dream of extending his railroad across the American frontier, an obvious metaphor for Western expansion and empire. In an allegory for America's colonial trajectory, Morton explains how he began his project in sight of the Atlantic, and wishes to reach the Pacific before he dies. Later in the same scene, a parallel is drawn between the rapid growth of this railroad empire and the tuberculosis spreading through Morton's bones, indicating both that Morton's terminal illness is a metaphor for Western decline and death, and that Western growth is analogous to a spreading disease. Where Morton represents the men of capital and industry who conceived of this empire, Frank can only denote the men of action who realized it through violent conquest. This is first suggested when he murders the immigrant McBain family in order to acquire the Sweetwater Ranch for Morton's railroad. During the aforementioned scene in Morton's train car, the two men muse on their history together in a discussion that serves as a coded commentary on the history of Western expansion. Frank, recalling that he has worked with Morton since his empire's beginnings, to remove small obstacles from the track, ponders on how far their endeavor has come, spitting out of the train car window to illustrate the white man's contempt for the world he has conquered. Later, we see him camped amidst the ruins of an Indian cliffside dwelling as a servile native cooks his food, an allusion to the white man's role as subjugator of America. This symbolism is made explicit when Frank, in a climactic scene designed to serve as an allegorical microcosm of America's history, hangs Harmonica's brother from a colonial arch. Just as the Indian dies, a white man takes a bite out of an apple, alluding to the forbidden fruit of the Book of Genesis. The murder of the American Indian, we are told in this sequence, was white America's original sin. Notably, this murder takes place in Monument Valley, the archetypal symbol of America's Western mythos, implying that this original sin is the truth behind the mythos. In light of this metaphorical subtext, the symbolic role of the film's Native American hero Harmonica becomes clear. He is the embodied vengeance of the white man's victims, a mystical personification of white guilt bringing judgment for our past misdeeds. Throughout the story, when asked his name, Harmonica responds only with the names of the many men Frank has killed, hinting at this archetypal role. In the aforementioned flashback sequence, we learn that the cry of the harmonica for which he is named is, quite literally, the cry of the white man's victims, serving as an ominous reminder of both his past sins and coming judgment. It is this judgment, we are told, that will bring about the redemption and renewal of the West, as it is Harmonica who ultimately determines the future of Sweetwater, ensuring that it is taken from Frank, the white patriarch and symbol of the Old West, and passed to Jill, symbol of the New. Where Harmonica is an agent of vengeance and judgment, Cheyenne is the sacrificial lamb who, knowing that he has no place in a changing world, dies to help win a better future. This sacrificial role is first implied when he delivers himself up as a bounty so that Sweetwater can be bought, the scene's dialogue drawing a direct parallel with the arrest and crucifixion of Jesus, suggesting an act of redemptive power. This is mirrored later when he sustains a fatal wound killing Morton and dies as the town of Sweetwater is built around him by newly arrived, primarily non-white laborers. Cheyenne, dying for the sins of the West, helps birth this multicultural new world. Where Frank, the bad white man, seeks to possess Sweetwater for himself, Cheyenne, the good white man, selflessly steps aside so that it can be claimed by others, becoming a heroic exemplar of white self-sacrifice. Jill McBain represents this better future. She is the New West personified, cleansed of the masculine greed and violence embodied by Frank. Jill's role as rightful heir of Sweetwater is a metaphor for this passing of the torch from man to woman, past to future, Wild West to tamed. More, it represents the Western world's moral transition from the formerly ascendant warrior ethos of strength and dominance to the pacified liberal ethos of modernity. As the white man departs into death and myth, only the white woman remains as the New West is born. Its prevailing symbol will no longer be the warrior, nor the capitalist, but the prostitute. This transformation is reflected in the film's closing moments, when Jill is encircled by a gathering crowd of non-white males, disappearing in their midst as she brings them water to symbolically baptize the new world they represent. These final frames, which have clear connotations in light of the changing demographics of today's Western world, serve to complete Jill's narrative arc, reversing the racial dynamics of her introductory scene, in which two black station attendants carry her luggage. This is a microcosm of the symbolic narrative underpinning the story as a whole, as the West, passing from master to servant, finds redemption in the loss of its power, or, to frame it in contemporary terms, through losing its privilege. The struggle over Sweetwater, then, is a metaphor for the tribal contest over America's future, a contest that the white man, we are told, is doomed to lose. The supposed inevitability of this outcome is symbolized by the railroad and the inexorable forces of historical progress that it represents, as it initiates a process of transformation through death, reshaping the West through purging its sins, breaching its borders, and bringing racial outsiders into its midst. In a conversation with obvious connotations just before the film's climactic showdown, a parallel is drawn between Harmonica and Frank as members of an ancient race soon to die out, suggesting that, in a twist of karmic irony, the white man is condemned to the same historical fate as the North American Indian. As if to leave us without any doubt as to the intended meaning of this symbolism, in the story's final moments Harmonica carries the dead Cheyenne, who is named for a once powerful native tribe, from the new town of Sweetwater as it is built. The white man literally goes the way of the Indian in these closing frames, passing from life into the annals of history as his replacements build a new world around him. Put simply then, this is the real meaning of Once Upon a Time in the West. The West in the film's title primarily denotes not the Wild West, but the Western world. The white man's civilization, it asserts, was founded upon violence and exploitation. His land and wealth is stolen, and he has defiled the world through greed and ambition. The power he possesses is, therefore, undeserved. Now sick, dying, and unfit to rule, his time has passed and his civilization will be claimed by others. This divestment is a rightful judgment for his misdeeds, and his non-white victims will serve as its agents. Once this process is complete, these non-whites will inherit our civilization, and those of us who live on will do so no longer as master but as servant, selflessly helping to build a future for our replacements. This transformation, though bittersweet, is a necessary stage in the making of a better world, and so there is, we are told, beauty in this defeat. What this means, in short, is that Once Upon a Time in the West is a mythic representation of the Marxist historical narrative, designed to convey its core ideas to a public resistant to intellectual persuasion but vulnerable to subliminal coercion. Over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, Marxist theorists quickly realized that, by utilizing the artistic world of symbols and archetypes to present their ideas in a coded form, they could effectively bypass the defense mechanisms of the rational mind and gain access to man's emotional, spiritual, and instinctual core. By presenting, for example, a hidden metaphor for societal class struggle in the form of a sympathetic individual's personal struggle, they could effectively elicit sympathy for broader Marxist ideas. Moreover, through writing within the framework of established mythologies, they learnt that they could exploit the pre-existing connotations of familiar symbols and archetypes. With the 19th century completion of the American project, and the expansion of European power that it represented, they found fertile ground for this campaign in its newly born founding mythos, the Western, which they immediately understood needed to be controlled. Its tales of conquest, told to inspire pride in America's history and to provide legitimacy to its foundations, were revised to frame the white man as an unjust interloper in a stolen land, the serpent bringing sin and death to a primordial Garden of Eden. Stories of tribal contests and personal vendettas on the American frontier became moralizing confessional tales, as the struggle for survival was replaced with the search for atonement as the prevailing narrative theme. Heroism yielded to the aggressive nihilism of the so-called revisionist Western, and the hero gave way to the anti-hero, more often than not a euphemism for the atomized white protagonist who cheats, robs, and kills his own. Our greatest historical deeds were now our gravest transgressions, and our fight for dominance in a hostile land over hard-won centuries became a cause for guilt rather than pride. Leone's magnum opus reflected this burgeoning mythological inversion, white man as villain of the Western story, and his sundry enemies as its unsung heroes. The good, the bad, and the ugly was already a coded metaphor for the redistribution of Western wealth to the non-white world, but it was with Once Upon a Time in the West that Leone perfected this civilizational allegory, as the contest for stolen gold became a contest for stolen land. Leone, however, did not shape this new mythology unaided. He instead drew from the well of Hollywood cinema and the ideas that it had seeded in the Western consciousness, narratives codified by films such as High Noon, Broken Arrow, and Shane. Unwitting audiences had already learnt that it befits a true hero to cast away his sheriff's badge and the power that it represents. They had learnt that it was noble for the white man to fight alongside the Indian and against his own. They took it for granted that he should walk into the sunset, as if this departure were his only fitting end. Few understood the significance of these symbolic defeats. Drawing inspiration from this cinematic language, Leone sought to craft a story that would encapsulate all of its central themes. In essence, he endeavored to provide the multicultural modern Western world with a revised founding mythology that would grant historical and moral legitimacy to its claims. But in order to realize this creative vision, it was necessary that the mythic heroes of old first die a death, and where better than upon the dramatist's stage, in the symbolic world of cinema. To this end, Leone constructed an allegorical tale centered around the struggle for land, a metaphor for our land, filling it with archetypal characters to serve as personifications of the manifold forces at play in our society. He reframed America's defining heroic archetype, the pioneer and frontiersman, as a sadistic brigand, choosing Henry Fonda for the role, knowing the symbolic significance of casting an actor known to all as the quintessential American hero. Then, he subjected this subverted paradigmatic hero to a judgment, and condemned him for his sins, in doing so singly condemning the Western world that he archetypally personified. Finally, Leone sought to convince us that, with this historical antagonist vanquished, a better future was within our reach, and that our civilization would find its apotheosis and ultimate fulfillment in its own death. Sweetwater, we are assured, will be a beautiful town. It is not likely, however, that in crafting this story Leone was motivated by a conscious hatred of his own people, culture, or history. His artistic creations seem to reflect a deep affection for the mythic and aesthetic world of the European tradition, but, like many of our people, Leone was divided between this instinctive love and the self-abnegating imperatives of the synthetic moral system to which he had come to ascribe. This system, through constructing a moral framework that stigmatizes any action serving the interests of the tribe over and above the human collective, necessarily alienates us from our own people and condemns all of our historical achievements, reframing our tribal victories as moral defeats and our tribal heroes as enemies of mankind. This being so, the racial other inevitably assumes the role of protagonist in our story, and his tribal need for vengeance and conquest is affirmed even as ours is denied. Under the thrall of this pervasive ideology, all of our mythologies must perish, and all our mythic icons must be toppled. Leone, fatalistically accepting the eventual triumph of this imposed moral order, sought to find consolation in the death of the West that it would necessitate, deceiving himself into believing that this death would serve a higher purpose in the world's redemption. This is the same self-deception that lies at the heart of the contemporary Western mind, as we strain dishonestly to convince ourselves that there is some nobility in our suicidal trajectory, that it is somehow better to lose than to win, all in order to cling to a set of discredited moral and racial ideals seeded by a group whose beliefs and behaviors are manifestly antithetical to these ideals. Nonetheless, because this system has been specifically weaponized to exploit our empathy, and because its central ideas are continually reinforced by all cultural institutions and creations, it is held to be above any rational critique, and so retains a death grip upon the Western mind. Until it is recognized as a fallible ideological construct, rather than the set of self-evident moral truths it claims to be, this grip will only tighten, bringing alienation, despair, and death. Even most great artists are only capable of channeling the zeitgeist, not opposing it, and Sergio Leone was no exception. The hegemony of the anti-white mythological language, its monopolization of the storytelling mediums, and its power in determining which narratives are permitted for public consumption presently ensures that almost all of our most capable creative minds will be either recruited into serving the interests of our enemies or silenced altogether. In an age where the very strength of our culture's creative power has been weaponized against itself, men like Leone, whose talents would once have helped to strengthen and enrich the European tribal identity, are now to be counted among its most insidious enemies. Once Upon a Time in the West is the product of a poisoned mythology, and if this false mythology is to be overturned, we must hold no story, no image, no personage above rebuke. If we are dying, it is because we died in myth first. If we are to live, we must live in myth again.